They called it the Atlantic Wall, an unbreakable fortress stretching from the Arctic to the Pyrenees. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, a 19-year-old German machine gunner looked through his concrete embrasure and saw something his mind simply could not process. A horizon blackened with ships, not one or two, but 5,000 vessels. In that single heartbeat, he knew the war was lost. This isn't the story of the liberators storming the beaches. This is the story of the men behind the concrete. The defenders who were promised impregnability and delivered, instead, into the furnace of industrial annihilation. For 4 years, the Third Reich had poured 13 million tons of concrete and thousands of tons of steel into this coastal barrier. At WN 62, a resistance nest overlooking Omaha Beach, veteran soldiers had spent months zeroing their MG-42 machine guns onto the sand. Every pebble was a pre-registered kill zone. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had personally inspected these positions. He famously declared that the first 24 hours would decide the invasion, and that for the Allies, it would be the longest day. The men inside the bunkers, many of them teenage conscripts or weary Eastern Front veterans, believed him. They had been trained to turn the beaches into a killing ground within minutes. The order was simple: repel or die where you stand. But logic has no place against a tsunami of steel. At precisely 5:50 a.m., the horizon tore open, not metaphorically, but physically. The Allies possessed the one weapon the German defenders could not counter: total naval supremacy. Battleships like the USS Texas and HMS Warspite did not just fire shells, they fired city blocks. The ground shook with the force of a continuous earthquake. Inside the bunkers, the air pressure from the concussions ruptured eardrums and forced blood from noses and mouths. Concrete cracked. Weapons that were bolted to the floor sheared off their mounts. This was not a battle. It was a geological event. One German lieutenant, stationed at the Crisbeck Battery, described the naval bombardment as the feeling of being a living anvil under a hammer, forged by the entire industrial might of America. The gunners could not see the ships clearly. They were merely silhouettes on the water, wreathed in a man-made fog of cordite and smoke. But they felt them. They felt their weight. And they began to understand that the Atlantic Wall was not a fortress. It was a cage. If the naval guns were the hammer, the air power was the scalpel and the scythe. Even before the landing craft touched the water, the sky turned black with the 8th Air Force. Thousands of bombers swept over the coastline. The German 352nd Infantry Division, holding the vital sector behind Omaha, watched in horror as their communication wires were shredded and their fuel depots turned into massive pyres. But the real panic began when the fighter bombers descended. These pilots were not dropping bombs blindly, they were hunting. A dispatch rider racing down a Norman lane with a box of ammunition would suddenly find his motorcycle dissolving beneath him, strafed by the wings of a Typhoon rocket. Inside the command posts, the telephones rang with the same desperate litany. Send us ammunition. We need shells. We are low on machine gun belts. But there was no ammunition to send. The supply routes were a cemetery of burning trucks and dead horses. The tactical genius instilled by Rommel, the rapid counterattack, the flexible defense, was utterly useless, because no one could move. The Allies had built a wall of their own, a wall of fire between the front lines and the German rear, and nothing could cross it. As the ramps of the Higgins boats splashed down into the bloody surf, the psychological collapse began in the German strongpoints. This was the material Schlacht. A veteran sergeant, gripping his Mauser rifle, realized that his training was a cruel joke. He was a master of trajectory, windage, and cover, yet none of it mattered because he could not lift his head above the parapet without it being ripped off by a hail of fire that never seemed to pause. He had been told to conserve ammunition, to make every shot count, but the enemy wasn't using shots. The enemy was using volume. One of the cruelest realities was the disparity in ammunition supply. In WN 62, the defenders were allotted a fixed number of belts for the MG-42. This weapon, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, could chew through a year's worth of German production in 6 seconds of panic. And panic was inevitable. When a wave of infantry 3 lines deep emerged through the smoke, the German gunners had a terrible choice: fire and deplete their stockpile within the first hour, or hold fire and let the enemy close the distance. They fired until the barrels glowed red, and then white, and then sagged. They reached for the next box to find it empty. The math was simple. For every ton of steel Germany could ship over sabotaged railways, the Allies were floating in 100. It wasn't strategy that defeated the German army that morning. It was inventory. And then there were the tanks. Not tanks in dozens, but tanks in hundreds. Duplex-drive Shermans, floating out of the sea like monsters from a science fiction novel. The German defenders, stripped of their Luftwaffe air cover by the roving Mustangs and Spitfires, had no eyes in the sky. The first warning many bunkers had of the amphibious armor was the sight of soaked canvas dropping, a way to reveal spinning turrets, followed by the muzzle flash of a 75mm gun aimed directly at their firing slit. A German gunner at Utah Beach remembered staring at the approaching DD tank and thinking not of a shot to disable it, but of the factory behind it. He knew, with a sickness in his stomach, that even if he knocked out that tank, another would steam up behind it, and another and another. The American factories never slept. The breakdown was not just material, it was spiritual. The German soldier was a product of a doctrine that worshipped willpower. They believed that superior discipline and fighting spirit could overcome numerical odds. But facing a naval bombardment, airstrikes, and endless mechanized infantry, the individual soldier disintegrated into a function. He was no longer a warrior. He was merely a target. Veterans of the frozen hell of Stalingrad broke down crying in the bunkers, not from fear of death, but from the revelation that their sacrifice had always been mathematically irrelevant. Surrender came not in a dramatic gesture, but in a dazed, slow realization. Men who had sworn oaths to fight to the last bullet emerged with their hands on their heads, their eyes glassy, looking not at the American infantrymen approaching with carbines, but staring past them, out to sea. They were looking at the Liberty ships and the landing craft that stretched to the vanishing point, unloading a stream of supplies that seemed as unending as the ocean itself. The prisoners were not asking for water or medical aid. They were asking the same question over and over. Where do you get all of this? How can a country build so much? The Atlantic Wall was not broken by a trick of strategy or a failure of bravery. It was swept away by the sheer, terrifying weight of a production line. The defenders learned a lesson that morning that no tactical school could teach. You cannot outfight an enemy who can outbuild you. The war was no longer a contest of generalship. It was a contest of crane operators, welders, and assembly lines. And in that contest, the men inside the concrete bunkers never stood a chance. They were not just defeated. They were buried under the avalanche of a new world power, one Liberty ship at a time. And as the sun finally set over that terrible, blood-soaked coast, a young German radio operator sat among the ruins of his shattered bunker. The firing had died down, replaced by the distant rumble of bulldozers clearing the beach. He watched the unbroken stream of enemy trucks rolling inland, headlights cutting through the Normandy dusk like a river of light. He looked down at his own empty ammunition box, then back at the horizon he once thought was impenetrable. With a quiet, hollow voice, he turned to his wounded commander and whispered the epitaph for the Third Reich. "Herr Leutnant," he said, "the factory whistles in Detroit are drowning out our guns.